it's Mo. It is August 4th, and I have finished one book so far in August, so it is time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. These are videos that I do every month where I talk about the books that I've finished in the month as close to when I finished them as I can muster, and I try to talk for about 5 minutes about each book. I try to tell you something about the book, the synopsis, but also my thoughts and feelings on the book, whether I liked it, and if I think you should read it too. The first book that I read in August, I actually finished on August 1st, and I was reading this on audio. It was Sundial by Catriona. I think that came out in 2022. It was like one of my most anticipated reads for 2022, and I finally found it on a free audio site, but I had been kind of putting it off / saving it for a rainy day, so I ended up using this for my Savage prompt of July, which was to read a book that you've been saving. Sundial follows Rob, who is a mother. She has 2 daughters, one who's like 12, one who's like 6. She lives like the suburban life in California, but something is off about her seemingly perfect life. Even though she loves both her daughters, she definitely feels that there is something going on with her older daughter, Callie, and when her younger daughter has an incident, she blames the older daughter, but instead of wanting to separate more from her older daughter, she decides to take Callie back to Rob's old home in Sundial. This home is in the California desert. Rob and Callie return there, and once there, Rob starts to tell the story of her life to hopefully connect with Callie and have some sort of explanation for the divides going on in their family. This story was bananas. I liked it. It was a romp. It was fun. It was not a book where you knew what was going to happen. It was not a book where you knew what direction it was going into. I thought it was a well-promoted book in that, like, I didn't know what to expect from this story, and some of the things that they kind of emphasize in the media of this is not misleading, but like not the full accurate depiction of what happens in this story. So this story goes off the rails. This book wasn't a very realistic story. You had to suspend your disbelief a lot. Sundial was definitely wacky, crazy, thrillery fun, and told in multiple timelines. So we have Rob from the present. We are also getting Callie's point of view, which is a little disturbing at times, and then we're also getting Rob in the past, as well as another storyline, which I'll talk about in a second. So within those storylines, thrilling things are happening in the present. You are concerned for Rob and Callie and their safety. Thrilling things are happening in the past. You are wondering where the story's going and what kind of all this secretive stuff is. And then in Callie's perspective, you're reading from a child, so you don't really know what is true and what is not true. She is a good description of like an unreliable narrator because you just can't trust that she's understanding what's happening because of who she is, but also because of her age. And then there's another storyline, which was like a book within a book, which that was the only part of this book that I really didn't understand, really didn't make any sense to me. I don't know why it was there. It seemed like kind of an afterthought. It didn't really add to the story in any way. And I think we could have very safely cut that out and not have had it in the book at all with no repercussion to the story itself. I mean, I definitely listened to that part of the story, but I just chose to not put very much emphasis on it and get through that part to get to the main meat of the story. So yeah, totally bananas, not what I expected at all. I did enjoy the writing style. It was not a writing style that felt realistic. It was not a writing style that you felt was at all possibly something that would happen. You had to suspend your disbelief, but once you did that, it was fun. It was a super fun, silly, like romp. You could compare it to something like Lucy Foley, where I read The Hunting Party by her, and that was like a fun, silly thriller romp, not well written, but like you wanted to know what happened, you were immersed enough in the story, you could let your imagination go wild with the imagery. It's not necessarily good writing, whereas I think Catriona Ward's writing was good, but it was so over the top that you really had to just hang on for the ride. Anyone who likes fun, silly, weird, thriller, horror books would get a kick out of this. You just have to go into it with that absolute camp experience going on. The caveat to that is that it had so much animal violence in it. It had animal testing, it had animal torture, it had ghost animals, it had animal murder. The story really was inextricably linked to animal violence. I hate that. I don't like to read about animal violence at all, but because it was in such an absolutely bananas manner, it didn't bother me that much. I mean, there were definitely some parts of it that really made me upset, but because it was so over the top, so unrealistic, so ridiculous, it didn't bother me as much as a realistic depiction of animal violence would have been. So if you are at all bothered by animal violence, I would say do not read this book. It is 100% about animal violence. I do really want to read more of Catriona's work. I hope that it does not have as much animal violence in it. So I do have The Last House on Needless Street, and I would like to get to that one. And that was the first book that I read in August. Hi. It is August 14th, and I finished 2 more books in August. I'm reading really slowly right now. I don't know if I feel like I'm in a reading slump because I am reading 4 books at the same time, so I feel like I am reading, but I'm definitely not reading at the pace that I'm used to. The next book that I finished in August is The Secret of NIMH. This was my TBR pick for July, but I didn't finish it until like the 5th of August or something. It's been a while since I did finish it. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a great, almost perfect middle grade, really interesting, a lot of interesting topics to be had. Great book. Like, if you have kids, if you like middle grades, you should definitely read it. That being said, while I wasn't reading it, I didn't really want to pick it up, but I just think that's where I am with middle grades and how much I don't really particularly want to be reading middle grades or YA at the moment. If you don't know what The Secret of NIMH is about, it is about Mrs. Frisby. It's also called Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. And Mrs. Frisby lives in a little house in a cinder block in the middle of a farmer's field. She lives with her 4 children. Her husband passed away last year, and it's almost getting ready to be spring, which is when her family has to move from their field home to a home by a little stream for the summer, and she is getting ready for that when her youngest son falls ill. So Mrs. Frisby needs to prepare him to move. She needs to get medication for him, so she goes all around and has some adventures. When the medication works, she's still not able to move her young son Timothy, so she has to have even more adventures. She has to seek out the help of some nearby rats, and she ends up learning their story. I mean, perfect for a child's imagination, perfect for thinking about the world from certain perspectives, just a really enjoyable middle grade book. The next book that I read in August was Clouds of Witness by Dorothy L. Sayers. This is the second in the Lord Peter Wimsey series. I've read 3 and 4, and now I've read 2. I have not read the first book. I enjoy these books. Lord Peter Wimsey is an aristocratic war veteran who has taken up the art of detection. So he and his manservant, they have many skills. They're able to do lots of things. Bunter is a photographer. Lord Peter Wimsey has done many things in his life. Partly his privilege has allowed him to do all these different things, but partly he's a decorated war veteran. He's very smart, but he's also very silly. He met up with a police officer, a detective named Parker, and they became fast friends and also colleagues who worked together solving crime. In the second book, they're kind of high off solving a crime from the first book when Lord Peter's brother is accused of murder. Peter rushes back from his vacation time to help his brother clear his name, solve the mystery, find out who the real murderer is, and deal with all those things. Of course, his manservant Bunter and Detective Parker are by his side helping him. So these are fun, silly, adventure-y, cozy mysteries. This was written in 1927. Most of them are written in the golden age of mystery, and Dorothy L. Sayers was considered a queen of crime, just like Agatha Christie. Whereas Agatha Christie is funny and witty and sharp in a clever way, I feel like Dorothy L. Sayers and Lord Peter Wimsey are very much like over-the-top, silly, ridiculous, a la P.G. Wodehouse. She's even said, there's a little note in the back, that she sees Lord Peter as like a cross between a more serious detective and Bertie Wooster. I definitely get that vibe from these books, and that's part of the reason that I really enjoy them. I do think that the plots tend to be a little bit meandering. A couple of the 3 books that I've read were a little bit overly long, and it definitely takes you a little while to get into the story. And then like in this book, once Peter's brother is absolved of the crime, then there's like a whole extra part that you have to go through to get to kind of solving the crime itself. They don't flow as naturally and as wonderfully as Agatha Christie by any means. I don't think that Dorothy L. Sayers is as talented as Agatha Christie or as captivating as Agatha Christie, but I do enjoy these mysteries. Now, I know some people have tried them and don't really like them. I'm going to stick with them. I'm excited to continue and see where it goes. I've been reading them out of order because I have a bunch of Peter Wimsey books. This was also my 100th book of the year. And when I read some more in August, I will let you know. It is August 17th, and I finished 3 more books in August. I finished People on a Bridge by Wisława Szymborska, and this was translated from the Polish by Adam Czerniawski. This is a book of poetry. I got this on my trip to Ohio. It was just one of several poetry books that I picked up, and I did make some tabs, so I will be making a poetry annotation video at some point. My poetry annotation videos are like half ASMR, half underlining, so that maybe you get a feel of the poetry and see if you would want to read it as well. They're not really like close readings or, you know, intricate annotations. But I did really enjoy this one. There were some interesting themes of like love and nature and kind of feeling small in nature. It was interesting. I would definitely be interested in reading more from this author as well. Next, I finished a short story collection, There Once Lived a Woman Who Tried to Kill Her Neighbor's Baby, Scary Fairy Tales by Ludmilla Petrushevskaya. And I started reading this one in July for Summerween 2023, but I didn't get a chance to finish it. This was a really interesting one because I am tempted to say that this was bad writing. I think it's very tempting to say that when a writing style is not like writing that you're used to and doesn't flow in the way a traditional Western narrative flows, that it's tempting to say, well, this is bad writing or bad translating. This was translated by Keith Gessen and Anna Summers. I think that it probably isn't either. I think that a lot of these short stories are a little bit experimental, and that is in part why the writing is the way it is. It doesn't say when the stories were created, so they could have been created a while ago. It is based on like folk tales and folklore. So this collection of short stories is all about kind of like unsettling, disturbing short stories with like a horror angle. In part due to the cultural differences, the Russian expression, the fairy tales, folklore, and history of a different place than my own. This writing felt disjointed and poor. I'm sure probably translation has a little bit to do with it as well, and definitely just the cultural translation of how I am very much used to a certain way of telling a story that many cultures come to very differently than the Western cultures. I love to tell people my dreams. I have a whole thing on my Instagram of dreams that I've had. I keep dream journals. I love to talk about dreams. I think dreams are extremely interesting, but there's that like cliche or that funny stigma that someone who tells you your dreams is like super boring and annoying and disjointed and nobody cares to hear your dreams. I don't think that's true because I love to hear people's dreams and I love to tell people my dreams. But That is what this book made me think of. It made me think of being a person who hates to hear dreams, being told a dream. Almost all these stories were very disjointed. They were very bizarre. They were told in a way that didn't make sense to my Western ear, and it sounded like someone making something up on the fly. It read like you were listening to someone's dream as they're remembering it. So you would start a story and the main character would be called like the old woman, and you'd go through most of the story that way, but then all of a sudden you would learn not only her name, but like the names of like 10 other characters who aren't even really in the book. Like you'll learn her husband and her son's name who aren't in the story. It just felt like someone making something up and just writing it down with no editing, no long-term goals, no thought process. I'm sure that that links in with the cultural differences, with folktales, with tradition. I'm sure that this was done intentionally. Maybe it was stream of consciousness short story writing, but that is intentional. This felt unintentional to my Western ear. I can't fault the book for that. There were a lot of unsettling things in these stories, much like nightmares told to you, much like dreams. There were many things that were disturbing or bizarre. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was one thing in a story, the significance was put on something else, or sometimes the significance of the story was the disturbing element. I think my favorite story in this collection was, I think it was called Hygiene, but it was about a plague that hits the city and a family finds out about this from someone knocking on their door. It flowed much more cohesively in a way that I'm used to, but also had some, really unsettling, disturbing moments, and also had some of that disjointedness balanced out in a way that made it a really powerful story to me, or a really interesting story to me. I would definitely read more by this author. I know that they have quite a few short story collections. I don't know. Would I want to read a short story collection, another one to get more used to this style of writing? Would I want to read a longer work to see if this was just their style for short stories? I'm not sure. I would definitely not seek this out. Like, I wouldn't go buy a book by this author, but if I found another book like I found this one at a used book sale or something like that, I would definitely pick it up. The next book that I finished in August was The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. This one I read on audio, and I really enjoyed the audio. I think it was the same narrator as Station 11. The Glass Hotel is about a collection of people who are all connected in some way through time and space, and they kind of convene at what the title is calling the Glass Hotel, which is a remote hotel in an isolated part of Canada. Our kind of main characters are Vincent and Paul, who grew up in that area, and we open the story learning about Paul and Paul's life and his relationship to his sister Vincent, and then learn eventually their connection to the hotel, their connection to the area, how they fit in with other people. And then we're following one of the people who has stake in the hotel. We're following someone that a businessman met at the hotel. We see how Vincent and the part owner of the hotel have connection. We see how all these people join together in some way over time. And this book does jump around in time a lot. It's divided into different parts, and it starts out in December 2018, and then it goes to 1994 and 1999, and it jumps around constantly, and each chapter of each part is also told in parts. You're jumping around between all these people and all these different timelines. It is very similar in that respect to Station 11. Reading on an audio was a little hard. I do have the physical copy, so I could have done it, but I couldn't go back when listening to the audio and be like, wait, what timeline are we in? Are we in 2009? Are we in 1999? Are we in 2018? But I don't think it was strictly necessary if you went with the flow. Although this takes place in a same but alternate universe as Station 11, it's not about the destruction of humanity or society, but it is a little bit about the breakdown of society and the breakdown of human-to-human contact and how that can be good or damaging. There was also some supernatural elements to this, some kind of ghostly elements, but those were fairly incidental and not necessarily like the larger part of the story. I think the larger part of the story in The Glass Hotel is the connections between people and how people can be seemingly oceans apart, huge distances away from each other, and still be connected, or how one person's action in one place and one time can affect a totally different person's circumstances in a totally different place and time. That is a common theme Emily St. John Mandel's work from what I've seen by reading the first 2 books that I've read by her. I can't wait to read Sea of Tranquility. My boss loves that one, and he's been telling me to read it for like 6 months, and he is actually the reason that I was inspired to read Station 11. I know that Station 11, The Glass Hotel, and Sea of Tranquility are all interlinked in a tangential way, but I think it's like one of those books similar to Taylor Jenkins Reid that you shouldn't go into looking for those connections, that you shouldn't be waiting for those connections and not experience the book on its own merits and on its own premise. I knew that they were all connected, so I wanted to read them in order so that I could let those connections wash over me, so I could let those connections come to me. And I was super happy to see the connections where I saw them in this book from Station 11, and I'm super excited to see the connections from these 2 books to Sea of Tranquility. And then I'm super excited to watch A.J. Dunn's long and probably intense vlog about all of Emily St. John Mandel's work. I do want to read her previous books as well. She has a very captivating but easy to listen to, easy to read style. You just don't want to stop reading it. You just don't want to put it down. I will say that the audio for The Glass Hotel, the reader is, I think, a woman, and she has a very feminine voice. And although she does different voices for some of the different characters, some of the voices she didn't always seem to fit with what I conjured in my mind of the character. A lot of times she used a very kind of high and feminine voice for a male character that I would have taken to have a lower and more masculine voice. Now, is that my own preconceived notions of what men and women should talk like or should sound like? Maybe, but I did find it a little bit confusing in parts, whereas I think if she hadn't done voices for them, or if she had done a more subtle voice for some of the characters, they would have been less confusing to me. I think this is such a beautiful cover. Those were 3 more books that I read in August, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is August 21st, and I have read 3 more books in August. Right? Yes. I read As You Wish, Inconceivable Tales from the Making of the Princess Bride by Carrie Elwes with Joe Layden, forward by Rob Reiner. This also has interviews with a lot of the cast members of the movie of The Princess Bride kind of interspersed. So it's an interesting take on a memoir where it is very specifically centralized, and then also it has more memories than just the memories of the memoir writer. This book is all about Carrie Elwes' experience making The Princess Bride, which, if you don't know, was a movie from the 80s. It's very famous. I think I put it away. And it was originally based on a book by William Goldman. William Goldman also wrote the screenplay. Rob Reiner directed it. Carrie Elwes was the star. He played Wesley, who starts out as a simple farm boy, and throughout the movie becomes something totally different to win back the love of his life, Buttercup, the titular Princess Bride. I highly suggest that you go watch the movie, and I would not read this book without seeing the movie first. I would definitely watch the movie and then read this memoir. This memoir was very plainly and conversationally written. It talks about Carrie's experience from the very first day that he found out he was going to audition for the role, to the very end of making the film, to the distribution of the film, and how it was received when it first came out in theaters and then later on VHS. Spans a large amount of time, and it's mostly told in like little stories about what happened in a linear manner. Some things are a little bit out of the linear timeline, but mostly it's that. And like I said, Carrie talks, and then also there are little sections where another cast member has like a small interview that interjects that talks about the same similar story. If you love The Princess Bride, this is definitely worth reading. It's very sweet, it's very simple, it's very easy to read. Carrie talks a lot about how wonderful it was to make the film, how much everyone who participated in it enjoyed it, what a special time it was for everyone, and how they became fast friends and almost like a family after creating the film. There's no high drama, there's no terrible things that happen. There's definitely some people who passed away since the film was made that Carrie eulogizes and memorializes in the book, but there's no like horrible, like someone was awful on set or something terrible happened. There's not a lot of drama in this book. You know, it's still such a sweet, fun story. It doesn't need something to move it along. It moves along just fine. It's also very short. If you have watched the movie, I highly suggest reading the book. The next book that I finished in August is Kim Ji-young, born 1982, which was written by Cho Nam-ju and translated by Jamie Chang. I read this book for Women in Translation Month. This is a very short novella about Kim Ji-young, and she was born in 1982, and it's basically just follows her life. We start off with her husband noticing some weird things that are going on with her. She seemingly has memory loss or regressive memory or something, and he comes to realize that she's actually projecting herself into the lives of other women that she knows and that are around her. He sends her to a psychologist, and then we see Kim Ji-young's life from infancy, well, even before she was born. We see a little bit of her mother's life, a little bit of her grandmother's life, and then throughout Kim Ji-young's entire life until now. She was born in modern day South Korea. It just kind of talks about all the trials and tribulations that women go through, about how Ji-young's mom didn't want her to have to put off her dreams or have to be a stay-at-home mom or have to adhere to the rules that were previously in place for women, now that it was a more modern age and a more enlightened time for women in South Korea. And we see how in some ways she does escape that old mentality, and in some ways she conforms to it. Although a lot of changes happen, it's very slow and difficult road for women in South Korea. So it's told in like a very clinical way, and it's told in a very straightforward way. There's a lot of stats and years and dates of things that have happened interspersed with her life, how that affected her or people or women around her. Like, it almost felt like reading nonfiction in a lot of ways, but then there is kind of a interesting twist. I want to say twist. It's not really a twist, but interesting literary structure maybe at the end that I wasn't expecting, and that kind of is very thought-provoking and leads you to think beyond even what was already a very thoughtful and thought-provoking book. This has been described as like extremely feminist, pertaining to the feminist movement in Korea, in South Korea especially. And I've been wanting to read this one for a while. I almost read it last year for Women in Translation Month, and then I almost read it earlier this year, but I was super glad to have gotten to it. I read this book on audio. It was super quick and easy to get through. I would highly recommend. Perfect for Women in Translation, or at any time to get more translated fiction onto your TBR, onto your radar, onto your red shelf. The next book that I read in August was The Door by Magda Szabo. This was translated from the Hungarian by Len Ricks. This book I've been seeing ever since I started BookTube, but I didn't even really know what to expect, so I'm super glad to have completed it. This book follows, I think she's mostly unnamed. I think they do name her later, but our main character, who is a writer, and she and her husband have recently moved to a small village to write and continue their careers. Her husband's career is going pretty well, and hers is kind of in a slump, but she's just coming out of that career slump, just coming out of that writer slump. They decide that they need a housekeeper, so one of the people that they know in the town suggests Emerence, who is a local woman who does housekeeping, but she also does like a million other things for this village. She's in close contact with the chief inspector. She is known for helping everyone and anyone with anything they need. She takes care of the sick people. She sweeps the streets. She's the custodian of a local apartment block. Like, she does it all. She never sleeps. She lives and breathes like working with her hands, working hard for the people around her, and still finds time to buy people gifts and bring them food for christenings or funerals or weddings, etc. So Emerence does decide to take the job with our main characters, and very quickly we see that Emerence is an extremely stuck in her ways, cantankerous, specific character, that the way she does things has been honed over time throughout her life, and she only changes them by her own means, by her own hands. She does not bend her will to any person, and that's a real struggle for our main character, who wants things done a certain way and who also has a very specific idea of the world and how the world works. We see that our main character and Emerence really clash in a lot of ways, fight like cats and dogs, fight like family members, but grow to love each other to the point of obsession and distraction. So that's the basic premise of this book, but there's so much more in this book having to do with these two women's relationship and having to do with the relationships that they have with other people in the village, family members, God, the government, so many different things. And I've often heard this book described as a book of an obsessive relationship, and I do think that that's true. I think that on both parts, the women become very much obsessed with each other and with the relationship as almost its own entity, but coming from such different backgrounds, coming from such different points of view, coming from such different ideas and ideals, it is like an incredibly negative, harmful, destructive kind of obsession. This book made me angrier and more upset and frustrated and pissed off than like any book that I've read maybe since joining BookTube. I really enjoyed it. I thought the writing was really interesting. Like I said, it's translated from the Hungarian. It definitely has that Eastern European style that I've come to notice from books written in Polish and from other Eastern European countries, even kind of Nordic countries. But since I've read quite a few of those, like, I'm kind of used to it. And that definitely didn't bother me. I enjoyed it a lot. And obviously the customs are different than my own. The culture is different than my own. So like there are things that you have to kind of suspend your own ideology or understanding of to accept in a different culture, right? But like the way that the main character acted was so selfish and despicable and horrible. Like, talk about an unlikable character. I don't know if I've ever read as much of an unlikable character. A selfish, self-centered, ridiculous person who would take the care that someone's giving her and just throw it back in their face, or take the love that someone was giving them and hate it because of their own selfishness. Oh my God, to like promise things, to say you love someone, to promise things, and then to utterly fail on those things, to not only fail but not even try to fulfill your promises. It was so horrible to read from, so frustrating, so angering, that I struggled through this book, especially the last like quarter of this book, maybe even the last third. I could only read like a couple pages at a time because our main character made me so furious and she was so awful. And I think that most people would say that Emerence was an unlikable character too, but Emerence I completely understood. She looked at the world a certain way, she had a certain ideology, and she stuck to it, and it made sense to me. Yes, she wasn't a very nice person, but she wasn't an unlikable human being. She was extremely human and humane, and she cared so deeply for everyone in this village and every person that she came in contact with, whereas our main character cared only for herself, a little bit for her husband, and the kind of guise of loving Emerence, which came to be almost like a mother-daughter relationship, was so infuriating because she obviously has no idea how to love or care for another person. Or animals. This book had so much animal violence in it, so much animal cruelty, just neglect. It was awful, and the main character is the root for a lot of it, not all of it. So I would say, if any of that sounds interesting to you, definitely read this book because I think it was excellent, but know that you're in for an absolutely frustrating read, that your reading experience will be painful and difficult and dread-filled and horrible in a lot of respects. That being said, I really did enjoy it, and I am glad that I read it. I read this one for Women in Translation Month as well. Don't forget that I do a readathon recap for all the readathons that I join throughout the month, which comes out after this video, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is September 1st, and that means that it's time to wrap up all the rest of the books that I read in August. I do need to look at Goodreads though, because I don't remember what order I read these in. I've finished 5 more books in August. Strega by Joanne Like Home. This is translated by Saskia Vogel, and I believe it's translated from the Swedish. This book is a very poetic purple prose look at a young woman's life as she leaves home as a kind of older teenager. She is like 17 or 18. She's leaving her house by the sea. She's going inland to work for a hotel that is like a known tourist attraction hotel. So we hear about her first getting there, we hear about the training that they're put through, we hear a little bit about her life beforehand and how she misses her family, she misses her town by the sea. We just see the day-to-day of these 9 girls that are working for this hotel that used to be a big deal, that many people used to come and visit, but now is really falling behind and failing in the tourist industry. The big event that happens at this hotel is a big festival where everyone from the town and people from other surrounding towns come and have like a wild party night at the hotel, and there's a lot of special things that the 9 girls working in the housekeeping have to do for this event, and one of the girls is chosen to perform that night. The next day, one of the girls is missing, and the end of this novel is all about our main character, Rafaela, dealing with feelings and emotions to do with this missing girl. I mean, okay, that's the basic premise of the book, but this book is like all vibes. All vibes. It has plot. It definitely has some plot, but this is much more of a vibes than plot book. This is much more of an aesthetic, feeling, emotional, beautifully written. Well, I mean, some would say it was beautifully written, some would say it was not. Purple prose, vibey book. I enjoyed this book. I liked it. It's not really a mystery. I liked the writing in this. I liked how poetic it was, how, I want to say like lyrical it was. I want to say like over the top, flowery language that was used. I enjoyed it. I don't always enjoy that, but I did enjoy it. It reminded me very much of being a teenage girl, and I think that that's what the author was going for. It was very much in your feels as a young woman, coming of age, learning about the world, feeling like you know everything, but like knowing nothing. And I liked a little bit of kind of mysterious thread throughout this, just generally about the hotel, about different things. But this book definitely doesn't have like a strong payoff. It doesn't answer a lot of questions that you have throughout the book. So if that's something that you really like, I think it's important to note that you're not going to get answers in this one. I enjoyed it as it was. It was quick to read. It was easy. There's definitely some violence, some sexual violence, and general violence that the world projects onto young women, but it wasn't extremely graphic. It could have gone really dark, like really, really dark, and it didn't. There was kind of just hints of those things. There was hints of mysticism or magic. It didn't go too hard in any direction except the vibe. The next book that I read in August was The Jaws Log by Carl Gottlieb. This was originally written in 1975, just a few years after Jaws the movie came out, and Carl Gottlieb was one of the screenwriters for the Jaws movie. So Jaws is based on a book by Peter Benchley, which I have also read, and Peter Benchley did the original screenplay, but Steven Spielberg brought in Carl Gottlieb to work on the script as the movie was being made and to streamline it into something that was more usable as a movie. Not only was Jaws Peter Benchley's first novel, he had never written a screenplay. He was not an author by original trade, but he became an author. He wrote many other books. He was a shark enthusiast and a waterman and a a water enthusiast in general. So a lot of the research that went into Jaws and a lot of the information about sharks was accurate to the day. The Jaws log is a book that Carl Gottlieb wrote shortly after making the movie Jaws and working on it day and night and being there every minute, meeting Peter Benchley, meeting Steven Spielberg, although he had known him previously, meeting all the actors and actresses involved, as well as the crew, as well as the people of Martha's Vineyard, which is where they shot the movie, which at the time had never been used as a movie location before. So there was a lot of small town politics going into just even that small aspect of the movie. This one was really interesting, especially after having just read As You Like It by Carrie Elwes, which was about the making of The Princess Bride, because this one was not such a happy, touchy-feely time on a movie set. It was almost 15 years before The Princess Bride was made. Things were not as streamlined and set out as they were even that 15 years later. So a lot of the things that Steven Spielberg and Carl Gottlieb and the crew and cast were doing was totally new, revolutionary, and it made an amazing film. If you've ever seen Jaws, it's incredible. It's definitely dated, but it holds up in many respects. So there was definitely a different feeling to this book than As You Like It. There's a lot more drama that happened. There was a lot more infighting. There was a lot more resistance from the townspeople. There was a lot more issues that happened with cast and crew. And this movie did not go off without a hitch. There were problems with making The Princess Bride that were unexpected, but this movie took twice as long, cost twice as much, was twice as stressful, probably 10 times as stressful as anyone could have imagined. So it was interesting to read those two books back to back and kind of see different perspectives of movie making. It was also interesting to see how in 1972-73 people were making movies and how clearly different, whether you know a lot about the movie industry or not, making movies is from then to now. So I really enjoyed this one. I really want to watch Jaws now, but I don't want to watch Jaws until I stop swimming for the year, which will be like maybe October. The water stays warm in New Jersey straight through September, usually the beginning of October. The water's still perfect, but the air is a little chilly to swim. But September is local summer here, and that's when we swim the most, so I don't want to watch Jaws until after we're done swimming. The book and the movie take place on Long Island. The film, like I said, was filmed in Martha's Vineyard, but a lot of the inspiration for this book was taken from shark attacks that happened right here in New Jersey, not very far away from us. So I have a couple of books, one of them is Close to Shore, about that time period, so it might be fun before the end of the summer to also read those shark attack accounts. I was really happy to read another nonfiction this month, and the next book that I read in August was The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. This book follows mostly Hannah, who is a nurse. World War II has just not ended so much as moved on from Italy. The war is still going on, especially between America and Japan, but World War II is kind of done with Italy and moved on. Hannah is a nurse and she opts to stay in a makeshift hospital, which is basically just the ruins of an estate, an Italian estate, to take care of her last patient who can't be moved. He's not going to make it. He's suffering from extensive burns all over his body. He can't walk. He can speak. He can move his hands a little bit. He can see, but he needs like a hearing aid. Not only can he not be moved, but he's not going to last an indefinite amount of time. And as the war moves on, Hannah decides to stay with him. She concentrates on taking care of the English patient. He doesn't seem to know who he is. He doesn't seem to remember much, but he is carrying a book with him that seems to be part diary, part scrapbook. She's very surprised when an old colleague of hers, a great friend of her father's, turns up at their doorstep and becomes assimilated into these two people's lives. We're are a little bit dubious about his character, but he helps them. Again, this trio is interrupted by a young bomb dismantler who stumbles upon the mansion and becomes part of this group. This book is all about learning about the English patient, learning about his history, learning about these other individuals, Hannah's life, what led her to give up her position as a nurse. We find out about Caravaggio, her father's friends, Hannah and Caravaggio's relationship, what Caravaggio's past is, and then we also find out about Kip, the young bomb expert who has been wandering around Italy since the war ended, dismantling every bomb he can find. The relationships between these people grow and change, and we learn more about their histories and their pasts. This was famously made into a movie with Ralph Fiennes and Emma Thompson, I believe. It is part love story, part thriller almost, because there are a lot of thrilling moments that happen, a lot of unexpected things, and there is a sort of tension that ramps up throughout this novel. Who the English patient really is, what his connection is to Caravaggio and the other people involved, and what his terrible secret past is all about. I've seen the movie many times. The movie is absolutely beautiful. It's lovely. It's like was made in the late 90s, early 2000s, that like merchant ivory art house film, beautiful, romantic setting. It reminds me a lot of the movie of Out of Africa. Not all the characters are necessarily likable. Not all the characters are trustworthy. Not all the characters do you want to see end up with each other or in a romantic situation, but you also are so drawn into the beauty of the landscape and the lyrical writing and the relationships between these people and the path that has led them to tragedy. I was really excited to read this book, and I'm starting a project to try and read the Booker books that I have. Now that I'm part of the BookTube community, it's hard not to want to read Booker books, to want to be involved in some of the big book prizes, but the Booker especially. So I think I'm going to go through and find all the Booker Prize winners and Booker Prize long list or short list books that I have and try to read those. And the first one that I did that with is The English Patient. I read this book on audio, but I also have a physical copy, and I was able to kind of leaf through as I was listening to the audio, find the different places where I stopped and keep track of it that way, which I find to be super fun as far as reading goes. I really liked the audiobook narrator. He did a really good job of distinguishing all the voices and the characters. I did find this book a little confusing the way that it was written. I liked it, and although it is kind of a beautifully written, it's also very simply written in the actual words, in the actual prose. But the way that it all comes together is a little bit more complicated because we're seeing the present with Hannah and the English patient, Caravaggio and Kip. That is happening in a linear fashion, but interspersed with that is the English patient reminiscing about things, Hannah's past coming to light, and then we'll have a long swath of the English patient's past, and then we'll have a long passage of Kip's past. And there's no real like distinction of when those things happen and when they don't. There is a break in the text usually when that happens, but reading it on audio, it just kind of flowed one to the other. I haven't seen that movie in many years, but in my recollection, the movie was very close to the book. But I think watching the movie actually helped because I was like, oh, this is the English patient's past, or I was like, oh, this is Kip's past. So it was a little bit easier for me to understand the transitions that were happening. On the whole, I really liked it. I don't know if I've read enough books from the Booker Prize that I can see why this was a Booker Prize winner, but I am super interested in reading more of Michael Ondaatje's work. He is Sri Lankan and he is Tamil, but emigrated to Canada. I think he's probably a very interesting author, and I'm excited to read more. The next book that I read in August was Kill File by Christopher Farnsworth. I've read one other Christopher Farnsworth book, and that was Blood Oath, which is the first in the President's Vampire books, and I really enjoyed that one. It was super fun, very much a romp, and this one was the same. This book follows John Smith, who is a psychic, and he is able to read people's thoughts and emotions. He's able to predict what they're going to do, and he uses this to his advantage. He's been through the Army, through the CIA, through special programming, and come out on the other side as a private contractor working for the rich and powerful to do things that other people can't do. So this book follows John Smith on a few of his assignments, I guess you could say, and how one of them goes sideways, how he meets some people who might help him, how we meet the people who have helped him in the past, and how he gets out of a unfortunate entanglement having to do with one of his clients. I really like this book. It was written in 2017. It is a little dated in some of the things that it says, and certainly I think in the way that it talks about war and soldiers. I don't know. I don't know if it would be more sensitive today, because maybe that's just the character and the vibe of the book. It struck me as feeling a little bit dated, but I think that some of the issues that John is facing in this book are not dated. The big brother always watching you, knowing what you buy, how you shop, where you eat, where you travel, all that stuff is like very relevant to today. Like our phones are always listening to us, and you might mention something and then look at your phone and there's an ad right there for it. This is kind of before that was happening to the extreme that it's happening today, but it predicts that behavior, data mining, and the whole idea of being constantly surveilled. This was super fun, fast-paced, silly. You know, John sleeps with a bunch of people and he kicks a bunch of ass, and it was just a fun, fast, thrillery, espionage, sci-fi spy book. And the last book that I read in August was Red Shirts by John Scalzi. Red Shirts is all about the crew of a spaceship who start to realize that something weird is going on the ship. They are the kind of secondary, tertiary crew on the ship. A bunch of people arrive as new arrivals, get to know each other, and our main character is one of these crew members, and he is one of the first people who starts to really see that something weird is going on. Everyone has like a weird obsession with away missions, which are missions that take crew off of the ship and onto various planets or different ships or space stations, etc. They also seem to avoid the captain and the 5 top crew members. So our main character realizes that every time the captain or a high-ranking crew member comes to their department, everyone scatters and he's the only one left. And when he goes on an away mission and one of his fellow lower crew member is killed, he starts to realize that this has happened multiple times before and that the new crew people are in the most danger. He confronts his fellow department crew members, and they kind of reveal that yes, this has been going on for a while since this captain came to this ship. They keep talking about one of their friends who is in hiding on the ship, who seems to have a theory about this. So our main character seeks out this mysterious crew member, and they try to unravel the mystery of why lesser crew members end up being killed. This is a very like meta story that is obviously based on Star Trek, but also talks about Star Trek. It kind of reminded me a little bit, and in some ways, of Galaxy Quest, which is a great sci-fi movie. I read this book because of Book Trek 2023, which was taking place in June, July, and August. I've also been wanting to read a John Scalzi book because he did like the Kaiju Preservation Society and a bunch of other books that I'm like interested in. He writes silly sci-fi in all different kinds of sci-fi genres, subgenres. I really enjoyed Red Shirts. I thought that it was super fast paced. It was like almost all dialogue. I read this book on audio, and Will Wheaton is the narrator, and I love Will Wheaton. Will Wheaton is famous for being on Star Trek The Next Generation. You may or may not know, but I love Star Trek. I love Star Trek The Next Generation especially. This book is really spoofing on the original series, but it definitely has the feel of a little bit of Next Gen as well. There are 3 or 4 parts to this book. So there's the main story, which is about what I described it as, and then there are little end stories. And I don't want to give away like what those stories are or how they're connected to our main story, because our main story does have more to do with just the crew of the spaceship, and it kind of ends on perhaps an existential sort of note. Then the following kind of codas, as they're called, have to do with that as well. I'm also really glad to read this in time for Sci-Fi September. I am doing a Sci-Fi September vlog. You can hear more of my thoughts on red shirts in that vlog, which will probably come out like at the end of September. If you like Star Trek, if you like Galaxy Quest, if you like spoofs on Star Trek, I definitely suggest picking this one up. It is very silly, very funny, a fun read. I read so many varied things this month. It's kind of crazy looking at it. I read a bunch of sci-fi. I read a Golden Age mystery. I read a middle grade book. I read some literary fiction. I read some nonfiction all about the movie industry. I read a book of poetry. I read a book of short stories. I read quite a few books for Women in Translation Month, and I read for a bunch of other readathons as well. I will be doing a readathon recap. I read a bunch of Eastern European women in translation. I read a Korean book in translation. I read from a Sri Lankan author. I read a Canadian author. Just a very varied month. A lot of interesting things. Mood reading really was at its height this month. Reading things that I wanted to read. I read a couple of my highly anticipated books. I am super happy with my reading month. I think it was a totally awesome reading month. I'm glad to have read so much. I wasn't expecting to read very much at all, and I read quite a few books. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I read here. Let me know what you thought of them. Let me know if you have any other questions about these books. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!